Hello and welcome to our wireless podcast series. My name is David Orlov from Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. This podcast is part of the ValEUs project, the Jean Monnet Policy Network, titled ValEUs Research and Education Network on Contestation to EU Foreign Policy. It's founded from the Erasmus program of the European Commission for a 3-year period starting from January 2024. This ambitious project involving 20 partner institutions from 17 countries across 5 continents focuses on scrutinizing the foreign policy of the European Union and the challenges posed to it. Today we are joined by Andrea Apollonio. Hello, Andrea. It's really good to see
Hi,
you.
hi David.
Well,
Thank you for having me.
Andrea brings a rare perspective, a sociologist who has conducted institutional fieldwork inside the European Parliament itself, interviewing MEPs, parliamentary assistants, policy advisors, and lobbyists about how historical memory is constructed, contexted, and weaponized. This connects directly to the values mission of asking whether the EU generally upholds its own values. Approach here from the inside out, examining how the institution produces and deploys memory narratives to legitimize or to challenge political agendas. Andrea, you spent time doing institutional fieldwork in the European Parliament, observing, interviewing MPs and their staff. What surprised you most about what you found when you got inside?
So, well, on a lighter note, I was surprised that they have very nice cafeterias and nice, very decent canteens. No, but jokes apart, what surprised me the most is the complexity of the field. During my master studies, I did my master in anthropology at the University of Milan Bicocca, and my first research experience was in a completely different sociocultural context. It was in Japan, Okinawa, and in a different setting. It was not an institution, but it was in fact a social movement. And the common thread, the fil rouge, is precisely memory politics between the two. But so with my PhD research, that's when I started working, doing research within the European Parliament. Um, it was my first experience in doing research in an institution, right? And yeah, I was surprised by its complexity, I would say. Um, Access to the field is obviously much more complex, and once inside, I was struck by the many layers of institutional life, and also by the centrality of informal interactions between actors. I had expected a more rigid, informal environment, and obviously it is. There are many rules, there's procedures, but in fact, there are many informal spaces of interaction where relationships are built, but also strategies are discussed and political dynamics, including dynamics relevant to memory politics, unfold. So this is what surprised me.
Thank you. Let's now discuss your dissertation. It's titled Politics of Memory and Narratives on History in the European Parliament. For listeners unfamiliar with the term, what do you mean by memory politics, and why does it matter that we study it inside an institution like the EP?
Um, so I define in my research, the definition I adopt is memory politics is as an unstructured field of political interactions where various memory entrepreneurs mobilize Europe's past, in the case of the European Parliament, to pursue goals and projects in the present. This is essentially what is EU memory politics. And I think it's relevant to study it in a setting like the European Parliament because the underlying assumption, or one of the dominant underlying assumption in memory politics research, is a distinction quite dichotomic between institutional memory or official memories on one side and memories from below, popular memory, memory activism on the other. And the analytical focus I found that was mainly on how precisely how institutional memories are contested from the outside. But one of the core arguments in my research is that actually that institutional memory is much more dynamic than we think. It's a much more dynamic phenomenon where multiple voices interact, various perspectives fight for institutional preeminence, and from time to time it changes, right? It shifts. Um, so yeah, this is why it's important for me because a clear, full understanding on how, on the sociological, let's say, dynamic and political dynamics underlying the construction of institutional memory still misses in the literature, let's say. So that's why I thought it was important and relevant to do an inside research in the European Parliament to see how institutional memory is produced.
Yeah, with regards with what happens inside the European Parliament, you mentioned the phrase memory activism. Can you give a concrete example of what that looked like in practice? How does a political group or individual MEPs actually try to shape how Europe remembers the past?
Yeah, that's actually probably the conceptual contribution of my work to the literature. There is a growing literature in memory studies on memory activism. And I propose this concept of interinstitutional memory activism to show how, to focus on how not really political groups, so formal structures, right, parties in a way, but informal memory networks, so political entities that look more like social movements, if you want, work inside within the European Parliament, so not from the outside. And I try to highlight specifically the work of a group of MEPs, of professional elected politicians that meet in these informal networks and discuss their strategy, their mnemonic strategies and priorities in an informal way, right? And trying to promote their own historical understandings and memory narratives within the legislative work of the European Parliament, trying to influence the calendar. Well, I also think I can maybe tell you a bit more what what are their main type of actions, right? What do these memory activists do to understand a bit better? Well, first they try to, I think they work on three channels primarily. First, they try to promote commemorative initiatives outside of the institutions, so by, for example, endorsing the construction of a new memorial in the city of Brussels, right? Collecting signatures within the MEP and showing endorsement for the initiative. Secondly, they try to promote commemorative initiatives within the European Parliament. The European Parliament, as I said, is a complex space where various things happen, including organizations of conferences, events, art exhibitions, things like this. And these activists engage in such initiatives by promoting conferences on a specific aspect of, I don't know, World War II history, or for the remembrance of some heroes, some relevant figure of the past. And finally, and probably most importantly, they try to influence the official positioning of the European Parliament in this field in three main ways, maybe. First, by expanding the commemorative calendar of the European Parliament. They try to promote new commemorative initiatives, sometimes managing to do so. Secondly, they promote their own amendments to ongoing, reports that someone is writing, someone is working on. And finally, they promote their own resolution, trying to create the political opportunity for this resolution to get to the plenary and being voted as such, as documents, as statements on a specific aspect of collective memory, on the role of collective memory as a whole for the European Union and the European integration process. So this is what memory activism is about in my frame and what it identifies in my research.
Good. The European Parliament represents countries with profoundly different and sometimes directly competing national memories. How does the institution manage or fail to manage those tensions?
Yeah, this is one of the features that makes, I think, the European Parliament so interesting for scholars that study the so-called transnationalization of memories. So this is a concept that emerged in memory studies some years ago, and the claim is that the nation state frame does not account for all memory processes or collective memories that happen to be out there in the world, right? Think about migration and how migrants communities thinks about their own past, in a transnational way. Or, for example, think about the European Parliament as a space where elected actors or hired agents from different geographical and national origin, but also of different ideological, political belonging, meet and interact. This is a very striking and interesting empirical setting, right, where to study this phenomenon of the transnationalization of memory. And the underlying question is whether such transnationalization actually happens or whether it doesn't, whether we just look at different people with different ideas, each one of them, promoting their own ideas, and at the end of the day, each one of them going home, not having changed their mind in a way or expanded, their horizons. Meaning, is a transnationalization of European memories actually happening in the European Parliament? Is some kind of shared European remembrance actually taking shape in the Parliament or not? This is, to me, the interesting question. I don't know if we want to delve into this, and I don't know, I don't have a full answer. But yeah, this is what makes the European Parliament interesting and to study for me as an object.
Yeah, of course, it's very interesting. And as you know, I studied the Balkan region, and all the countries in the region are willing to join EU, but the narratives are so much different, and it's close to impossible to find some common ground, and might be incredibly difficult for the politicians within the European Parliament.
Yeah, and maybe I did not fully answer your question because you were asking me, maybe you can repeat the question, but you were asking me, I got lost while I was talking, but you were asking me whether the parliament actually manages
Yeah.
to bridge these differences. I think the European Parliament has managed in some moments to produce some kind of shared frameworks of remembrance.
Mhm.
Holocaust memory was the most prominent, and it's obviously still very prominent, but it gained prominence especially since the early 90s to the early 2000s. And then it was incorporated, let's say, in a broader, especially after the Big Bang enlargement of 2004, it was incorporated in a broader anti-totalitarian framework. So I think to some extent, and without full consensus, maybe we get to this point later, I think the European Parliament and the European Union as a whole managed to promote some shared frameworks rather than homogeneous understanding of history, right? Some shared frameworks to look at the 20th century history, especially in the way that it developed on the European continent. Whether it's more complicated to say whether this framework was effective in promoting a deeper sense of European belonging in member states, and even more complex to say whether how these frameworks were received and actually used in member state. I say this because I'm Italian, and European Parliament memory resolutions, especially recent anti-totalitarian resolutions, are used sometimes by far-right actors, not as mentioned, the title of these resolutions are directly mentioned, not really to endorse, as we said, an anti-totalitarian Europeanism, but rather to not to endorse Italian anti-fascism, which is at the core of Italian, constitution, etc. So yeah, to summarize, the parliament managed to promote some kind of shared frameworks, but their consequences, I think that's another story, and it deserves a specific attention.
Actually, last May, I attended a conference in Italy commemorating 80th anniversary of the victory of anti-fascism over fascism. And obviously that's because our research projects are very similar, and I also devoted a lot of attention to revisionism, to totalitarianism. So my next question would be on this topic. There has been a significant controversy in recent years about how the EP handles the memory of totalitarianisms, equating Nazism and Stalinism, and debates, well, some even would equate anti-fascism to another form of totalitarianism, and debates about memory and conscience of European resolutions. How do you read those controversies through the lens of your research?
So I think that EU memory politics, as I said, became a much more contested and contentious field after the 2004 Big Bang enlargement, where post-World War II historical experiences among member states objectively diverged, right? And so different historical sensitivities were present in the same institutional arena. Um, I think the so-called equation of Nazism and Stalinism, or others say Nazis and communist ideology, um, I think it's not as it's still there for sure, especially as a line of division between conservative right actors from Eastern Central Europe and radical left actors from Western Europe, but it's not as prominent as it was in those years. And I think it was probably more evident. Again, I speak from the vantage point of an Italian citizen. I think it was much more prominent, for example, in the Italian public debate, where these anti-totalitarian European Parliament resolutions were adopted rather at the European level. I think the genuine attempt that, again, broadly speaking, I'm not speaking of individual actors, but in general terms, the attempt that the European Parliament tried to promote was to bridge uh, divergent historical experiences under a common framework, which is that of anti-totalitarianism, condemning both Nazi-fascist totalitarian experiences and communist Stalinist totalitarian experiences, right, under the same overreaching framework. Um, so yes, this would be my answer. I think such conflicts vary depending on the member states where these debates are discussed, and at the European level, I think it's now much more accepted than it was maybe before. Yeah, that's what
Mhm.
I would say.
In my case, it was very similar when I was studying anti-fascist culture. It led me to the current state of affairs and to the cancel culture that you're also writing about and memory conflicts in public space. So where do you see the line between legitimate historical revisionism, updating how we understand the past, and the political weaponization of memory?
Yes. Um, Okay, just a premise first. I worked on cancel culture, but I treated it not as an analytical lens, but rather as a discursive political frame, right? Something that the actors talk
Mhm.
about. Whether it's actually there, it's not really what I worked on. Um, I think um, debates about historical memory are a constitutive part of a society that goes through social change. So in a way, it's not natural, but it's cultural. Let's say it's part of how culture and societies work and develop through time, right? They assess critically the inherited narratives of remembrance, and they adapt it to current, ongoing, contemporary values and times. The problem, I think, emerge when political authorities try to silence this debate rather, right? Or to uniform it by enforcing top-down understanding of history. And I think in this sense, institutions should rather, and European institutions particularly, while I see the value, obviously, of having the importance of having common narratives of remembrance for identity building purposes, I think the focus should be on promoting this debate, on acknowledging diversity of perspectives, and yeah, on strengthening historical consciousness, critical consciousness as a social skill from below. That's my perspective on it.
Mhm. All right. Another interesting part of your dissertation to me was a crisis of historical imagination. So you've written about it and about the difficulty of envisioning alternative futures when our relation with the past is so contested. So what does this crisis look like in European politics today?
Yes, I use that concept. Other authors mm, and the researchers talk about very similar things using different words to describe this social-cultural condition in which societies and individuals are increasingly losing the capacity to imagine the future, especially to imagine the future in positive and generative ways. And obviously, there are good reasons for that, right? We are surrounded by catastrophic events, violence, and also media representations and images of such events are negative, obviously. And as Appadurai used to say, the culture is a cultural fact, a cultural capacity, right? Um, um, I think in European politics, this is visible in the prominence of nostalgic visions over utopic or generative visions of the future. And political discourse often look backwards towards, restoration, loss, decline, rather than toward the transformation, possibility, promises. And that is why I think the concept is useful because it helps us identify a broader cultural and political juncture that many societies, probably not just European societies, are struck within.
Mhm. Italy was really interesting to me when I was last time there. So it was not my first time in Italy, but last year I noticed a lot of probably revisionism and rehabilitation. On the one hand, it was the anniversary of anti-fascism's victory, and it was all over Bologna, and Bologna, I believe, is known as an anti-fascist city. But at the same time, there were souvenirs of cups with Mussolini's face and everything else, and really 10 meters away from one place to another. So, how does it work in Italy?
Well, this is a very broad question. And mm, let's say, I think um, far-right actors are probably today, the most successful users of memory politics
Mm.
at their own advantage, precisely promoting nostalgic visions of the past and ideas of a corrupted European civilization that they can save, right? This was also visible, if you remember, in this strategic document the White House released some months ago, in which the European Union itself was framed as an actor that contributes to the corruption of European civilization as based on conservative values. And in this sense, I think the European Union, or in general pro-EU actors, rather than reacting in a defensive way, should focus on promoting their own positive image and narratives about the future, trying to engage, with politics of memory in a more generative way. I don't know if I answered directly to your question, but this is what
Sure,
comes
sure.
to my mind when you mentioned that Italian example.
It's a good answer, thank you. And we could move to my last questions for you today, Andrea. So, moving back to the wireless project itself, it asks whether the EU genuinely upholds its own values. From your
Mm.
research inside the European Parliament, do you think that EU's use of historical memory reinforces those values, or can it actually contradict them?
Well, mm, I think EU memory politics is embedded in European values and vice versa at the level of discourse, let's say. For example, the so-called anti-totalitarian framework depicts, condemns totalitarian experience of the past century, while at the same time framing European integration as a story of full realization of liberal democracy and the rule of law on the European continent, right? So in this sense, yes, European memory framework are embedded in the European values, but as I told you before, another matter is to actually measure and evaluate the consequence of the adoption of these EU memory frameworks, and especially the reinterpretation at the national member states level. That's where the matter gets more tricky, and that's the level in which the connection between memory and values is less, how to say, less stable and yeah, not necessarily so clear, so to say.
Andrea, thank you very much for your time joining me today. I believe this podcast would be interesting to our viewers.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks a
David.
lot.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.